You're not going backwards. I know it feels like you are. Because one day you feel clear, you feel regulated, you feel like you finally understand yourself. And then suddenly, the old thoughts come back. The old reaction comes back. The old version of you shows up again. And your first thought is, I knew it. I haven't really changed. But what if that isn't true? What if the old pattern returning doesn't mean you failed? What if it means your nervous system reached for the safest thing it knows? Because your brain doesn't always choose what's best for you. Sometimes it chooses what feels familiar enough to survive. And once you understand this, you stop using every old reaction as proof that you're stuck. You start seeing it as information. And that changes everything. When you start changing, there's often this quiet expectation that progress should feel like a straight line. You regulate, you journal, you reflect, you learn something new. And then you think, okay, I should be different now. But healing rarely moves like that. Most of the time, it feels more like stepping forward than being pulled back into something familiar, than noticing it faster, than returning again. And that can feel discouraging, because when an old pattern returns, it feels personal. It feels like proof. You may think, this is who I really am. I always end up here. Maybe I was just pretending to change. But pause with me for a second. The fact that you noticed the pattern already means something has changed. The old version of you may have reacted without awareness, but the new version of you is watching. That matters, because awareness is often the first sign that your identity is shifting. Not the final sign, the first one. So if you feel like you're going backwards, look closer. You may not be back where you started. You may be standing in the same pattern with a new level of awareness. And that is not failure. That is the beginning of separation.
Your brain is always trying to protect you. Not always in the way you want, but in the way it has learned. If an old pattern helped you survive before, even if it exhausted you, your brain may still label it as safe. Overthinking may feel awful, but if overthinking made you feel prepared, your brain remembers that. People-pleasing may drain you, but if it helped you avoid conflict, your nervous system remembers that. Shutting down may make you feel disconnected, but if shutdown protected you from overwhelm, your body remembers that too. This is why old patterns don't disappear just because you understand them. They were not built only from thoughts. They were built from repeated states, repeated emotions, repeated survival responses. And your nervous system doesn't release familiar protection just because your mind says, we don't need this anymore. It needs evidence, repeated evidence. It needs to experience, I can respond differently and still be safe. That's the missing piece. You're not trying to convince your brain with one big breakthrough. You're teaching your body through repeated moments of safety. That's how change becomes real. Not dramatic, real.
Here's the part that can feel confusing. Old patterns often come back strongest right when you are actually changing. Because change creates uncertainty, and uncertainty can feel threatening to the nervous system. Even when the change is good, even when it's something you prayed for, even when it's the life you said you wanted. Your brain still asks, do we know this? Have we survived this before?
Can we predict what happens next? And if the answer is no, your nervous system may reach for the old pattern. Not because the old pattern is better, but because it has a map for it. Think about it like this. If you're used to chaos, calm can feel suspicious. If you're used to disappointment, receiving can feel uncomfortable. If you're used to forcing things, ease can feel unsafe. So when peace starts to enter your life, your brain may not immediately relax. It may scan for what could go wrong. It may pull you back into control. It may make you doubt the very thing you wanted. And then you might blame yourself. But this is not proof that you're broken. It's proof that your system is still learning how to feel safe in something new. Just let that land. Sometimes the old self returns, not because you're failing, but because the new self still feels unfamiliar.
This is where Neville Goddard's teaching becomes very important. Neville taught that you must assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. But here's what most people miss. The feeling of the wish fulfilled has to become natural, not forced, not performed, not repeated from a place of pressure. Natural. And if your nervous system still associates your old identity with safety, then the new assumption may feel unstable at first. You might say, "I am confident," but your body still feels exposed. You might say, "I am chosen," but your nervous system still expects rejection. You might say, "It is already done," but your body still feels like it has to chase, fix, or prove. That doesn't mean Neville was wrong. It means the assumption has not become embodied yet. Because your body chooses the state before your mind can hold it. That's why regulation matters. You're not just trying to think like the new version of yourself. You're teaching your system that it is safe to be that version. Safe to receive. Safe to stop forcing. Safe to no longer identify with the old reaction. That is how the new assumption becomes stable. Not because you repeated it harder, but because your nervous system stopped fighting it. So what do you do when the old pattern comes back? First, don't panic. That panic is what turns the pattern into identity again. Instead of saying, "I'm back to my old self," say, "This is an old safety pattern showing up." That one sentence changes the meaning. It takes you out of shame. It puts you back into awareness. Then ask yourself, what is my body trying to protect me from right now? Not, what's wrong with me? Not, why am I like this? But, what feels unsafe right now? Maybe it's uncertainty. Maybe it's being seen. Maybe it's receiving something good. Maybe it's not knowing what happens next. Once you name the threat, you can begin to regulate around it. You can breathe. You can pause. You can soften your body. You can choose one small response that does not match the old pattern. Not a perfect response, just a slightly different one. That's how you build new evidence, and your brain needs evidence. Every time you notice the old pattern and return gently, you are teaching your nervous system. We don't have to go all the way back. We can feel this and still move forward. This new version is safe too. That is progress, even if it feels small. It's not that old patterns never appear. It's that you relate to them differently. You notice them sooner,
You recover faster. You don't believe every thought as deeply. You don't collapse into shame as completely. You pause where you used to react. You question what you used to obey. That is nervous system change. That is identity change. And it may not look dramatic from the outside, but inside, something powerful is happening. You are no longer fused with the old version of yourself. You are witnessing it. And what you can witness, you are no longer completely controlled by. That's why this matters. You don't need to prove you've changed by never struggling again. You prove change by returning with more awareness, more compassion, and more choice. That is how the new self becomes familiar. That is how the nervous system learns. That is how belief finally stabilizes.
Pause here for a moment. Head down to the comments. On mobile, swipe left in the comments section to reveal the quiz. Tap your answer, then continue. What does it usually mean when an old pattern comes back? A. You failed. B. You lost all your progress. C. Your nervous system is returning to what feels familiar. D. You need to force yourself harder. The answer is C. Your nervous system is returning to what feels familiar. Not failure, not weakness, a familiar safety pattern. And now that you can see it, you can start responding differently.
So if you've been feeling like you're going backwards, take a breath. You may not be going backwards. You may be meeting an old pattern with a new level of awareness. And that awareness is the beginning of freedom. Your old self may still appear, but it no longer has to lead. Your nervous system may still reach for what feels safe, but now you can gently teach it something new. And in the next video, we're going to go one layer deeper. We'll break down why forcing yourself to change creates even more resistance, and what actually allows change to feel natural. Because change doesn't become permanent through pressure. It becomes permanent through safety. We regulate the body first, so belief finally works.